And it is one of the very few Portuguese residents in England who has become almost a household name. Catherine of Braganza, wife of Charles II, who arrived here as a bride in 1662, shortly after Charles's own return from exile during the Commonwealth, when, if you remember, there was no king and England was ruled by Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector. Queen Catherine, Dona Catarina de Bragança in Portuguese, may have been of royal birth. Well, she was of royal birth. Her father was King John IV. But in the English historical tradition, she has become a pathetic figure, almost a figure of fun. Small in stature, dark, and very foreign-looking, she had great difficulty in holding her own against those strapping ladies the king frequently took as mistresses. All the more so because Catherine, unlike the mistresses, was unable to bear children, though she seems to have conceived more than once. The marriage, which was, like all royal marriages at that period, a way of sealing a treaty, came at a time when Portugal's political fortunes were at a very low ebb. This was an occasion when Portugal needed the alliance more than ever, though English assistance did not come cheaply. Portugal was ruled by Spain for 60 years, between 1580, I mentioned Philip's invasion, and 1640. John IV, the first king of the House of Braganza, was the initially reluctant leader of a rebellion which led to the restoration of independence in 1640. And that act of defiance against the Spaniards was followed by a protracted war in which neither of the combatants, which were both militarily and economically weak, could gain the upper hand. King John found himself obliged to negotiate with the hated regime of Oliver Cromwell, which was detested throughout Europe because Cromwell was a regicide. In other words, the English had killed their king and set up a republic. And that didn't go down well in the monarchies, Protestant or Catholic, of Europe. However, poor King John was reduced even to negotiating with this pariah, Oliver Cromwell. And the negotiations dragged on, and he finally secured a deal with the regime of Charles II. And it's described by Anthony Disney, who, his name will appear in the transcript of this lecture, but he's the author of a recent history of Portugal and its empire published by Cambridge University Press, which I strongly recommend. And this is how he describes the deal. The deal with Charles II was an important breakthrough, for it reaffirmed the Anglo-Portuguese alliance. I mean, the Anglo-Portuguese alliance has always existed, but it's no good if the Portuguese wanted something appealing to a treaty that was signed in 1386. It had to be brought up to date. It brought Portugal explicit promises of English protection against Spain and Holland, and it signalled international acceptance of the Braganças' royal credentials because they'd had to fight their way to the throne, as I explained. But the price was high. Confirmation of all the commercial concessions granted to England in 1654, plus a famous dowry for Catherine, which comprised Bombay, Tangiers, and 2 million cruzados in cash. The cash component long remained a burden to the Portuguese people, and in the end was never fully paid. And the Viceroy, the Portuguese Viceroy of England, was also very unwilling to surrender Bombay to the English, and he tried not to, but in the end was forced to obey orders. So, poor Queen Catherine did not have a strong hand to play when she came to England. She came from a country that did not count for much internationally, and she was constantly upstaged by those big, bouncy girls the king had such a liking for. And she took a long time to be accepted in England, not least because, and this is where the plus element comes, she was rather more civilized than most of the people who surrounded her. As is well known, one of her first acts on arrival in England as the bride in 1662 was to ask for a cup of tea. None was forthcoming. For in the 11 years during which England was without a king, London had become very out of touch with modern continental fashions, and in England people, even queens, still drank ale, even at breakfast. And one of the reasons for this, the English out-of-touchness, was the unpopularity, as I've already explained, of Cromwell's regime abroad. The European monarchs regarded the English Republic as a pariah state, even though, as the example of John IV shows, they sometimes had to have dealings with it. The Queen had other domestic interests besides tea. She was knowledgeable about what we would now call design, and introduced cane furniture into England, another taste which has lasted to the present day. Another rather more significant enthusiasm of Catherine of Braganza was for music. Musical culture did not disappear under the Commonwealth. The Lord Protector himself had a liking for it, but again, it was cut off from European developments. Now, the Braganza family, the royal family of Portugal, liked music. The Queen's father, King John IV, was more than just an amateur, but a composer of pieces which are still performed, and an author of technical works about music. Technical works in Latin, of course. The Queen herself had a particular regard for Italian music, and she was able to exercise patronage, at first through her private chapel. Under the terms of the marriage settlement, Catherine, a devout Catholic, was allowed to maintain her own chapel, although, of course, the English were very touchy about Catholics, but the Queen was allowed to have her own chapel. And this was a large-scale affair with a considerable staff of priests, monks, and musicians. It was housed first in St. James's Palace and later in Somerset House. Although the Queen was not the first to bring Italian music to London, her patronage was extremely important. It led eventually to the first performance of an Italian opera in England. At the wedding ceremonies of the future James II, who was Charles's brother, and Mary of Modena, an Italian lady, also a Catholic, who became a great friend of Queen Catherine. I'm sure you've heard of Samuel Pepys, the diarist and famous Londoner, who was another enthusiastic amateur musician and who had access to the Queen's music. And it's interesting to see how his reactions to the new music changed over time. In 1662, the year of the Queen's marriage, he was dismissive, and I quote him, "I heard their music too, or their musique, as he puts it, too, which may be good, but it did not appear so to me, neither as to their manner of singing, nor was it good concord to my ears, whatever the matter was." One has the feeling that in musical terms he was out of his depth. He didn't know what the matter was. Here was new music, what is more, foreign new music, and he wasn't used to it. But by September 1668, that's 6 years later, he was more appreciative, and I quote him again, "The Italians came in a large barge before the Queen's drawing room in Somerset House, which in those days was closer to the river than it is now. And so the Queen and the ladies went out and heard it," they heard the music, "for almost an hour, and indeed it was very good."